Described on release in 2010 as the espionage RPG, Alpha Protocol didn't make the best first impression. For what was ostensibly a stealth game, it tripped up with one vital detail: its sneak-in animation. Arse up, head down, Alpha Protocol's lead super spy Mike Thornton shuffles his way through the world of international espionage like no other. It's a small thing, but Obsidian's game was arguably undone by the small things. An uneasy mixture of third-person stealth and hidden dice rolls, so it's situated awkwardly within the RPG genre at large, and pushed into a market in which it arguably had little place. Inconsistent enemy AI, claustrophobic level design, and a single misjudged animation ensured that it shot just wide of mainstream acceptance and has gone unnoticed ever since. Alpha Protocol wasn't without its charms though, and for those who managed to look past its rough edges, past Mike Thornton's every pained little step, Obsidian's game offered a compelling take on the idea of a choice-based narrative. Its disavowal of traditional video game ethics, in particular, renders Alpha Protocol a fascinating, playable proof of concept, even if no one would ever consider it a great game in its own right.
So, Mike, what brings you to this exciting corner of the world?
Secret agent.
Right.
When we're presented with choice in video games, we're often asked for a moral judgment. In games that give us the choice to act upon a narrative, we're either given the choice to do right or to do wrong, and the game responds accordingly, either with a pat on the back or a cheeky slap on the wrist. To choose one path over the other is to act in accordance with a specified ethical framework. If we choose to do wrong, we acknowledge that we're doing wrong, that we're going to favour ourselves over others, and vice versa. Any given meter of morality, from Mass Effect's Paragon Renegade bar to Fallout's numerical karma system, ultimately rests on a predetermined good-bad dichotomy. When you make a choice, there's no relativity, no subjectivity, just a universal constant telling you whether what you did is good or not. We can't determine what good is. Our choice is one of action, but never of ideology. In Mass Effect, for example, you couldn't question the game's assumption that shooting a rogue arms dealer was a bad action, any more than you could question it for assuming that killing hundreds on a quest to recover a family heirloom was a good action. Good is good, bad is bad, and you operate knowingly within that framework. This is perhaps why, for all of its faults, the most impressive thing about Alpha Protocol is that it doesn't seem to care.
What do you want?
I'm here to fix the computers.
We don't have a problem with the computer.
What the hell just happened?
I'm on a deadline. No time to jump through hoops. I'm gonna patch into their computer and get out of here before the cops show up. I'll be in touch.
Alpha Protocol's storyline constantly threatens to splinter off in any number of directions. The titular Alpha Protocol, a deep-cover intelligence gathering agency, or spy agency, is revealed at an early stage to be corrupt, leaving it up for grabs for a faction or entity of the player's choice. With this endpoint in mind, the player is set loose on an openly structured series of missions. Linear stealth crawls, or depending on the player's proclivities, shooting sprees through any number of themed corridors, each bookended by, and in a few cases consisting of, extended dialogue trees. These dialogue trees silently determine who the player will be cooperating with or fighting against going forward. The narrative outcome can differ dramatically from one player to the next, whether they decide to run the straight and narrow in the service of the American government, pander to the ego of corrupt capitalists, or collaborate with religious extremists in the Middle East. One of the few widely celebrated things about the game on release was its chameleon-like narrative structure, one that largely stayed true to its players' whims.
I'm here to see the Red Lion. I'm a friend of the Sheik.
For both better and worse, this leaves the game itself largely amoral. In the introduction, in an underground bunker labelled the Grey Box, the player is told that there are no bad choices, just results. And this is a line that the game itself follows to the letter. As a narrative device, the Alpha Protocol project seems to be constructed to give its agent, the player, as much ethical wiggle room as possible. By indulging in the fantasy of international espionage, they are granted the freedom to move as they see fit, divorced from any wider moral scrutiny. A significant effect of this is that dialogue options are established as conscious performance. Before the game's first mission, Thornton is told that he's been chosen for this mission because he's skilled at manipulating others, and informed about the benefits and drawbacks of angering or befriending his contacts. From this point onwards, the real Mike Thornton becomes little more than a product of the player's imagination. The game refuses to look inwards and speculate on what Thornton's controlling player is hoping to achieve, but instead concentrates only on Mike's outward appearance, focusing on the persona he emits, what he's actually achieving, and how other people react to it. The player isn't assumed to endorse their actions, and this removes the inconsistency between intended choice and scripted action present in games like Mass Effect. Dialogue options are instead split into 3 distinct guises: suave, aggressive, and professional, each of which evokes a very specific performance, sold in the run-up to the game's release as Bond, Bauer, and Bourne. In a lot of ways, it bears resemblance to Deus Ex Human Revolution's dialogue system. The assumption is that our character isn't directly manifested in their dialogue choices, but is rather approaching conversation as another facet of their job. Whereas Deus Ex penalised its player for failing to give the right performance though, Alpha Protocol merely runs with it, allowing its player to construct a hellish, Frankenstein's monster of a persona, one that ebbs and flows between pacifism and psychopathy, and that follows them around for the duration of the game. Characters angered in the opening few hours can go on to become the game's focal antagonists, while those that proved the centrepiece of one playthrough can become little but footnotes in another.
She died. Alone. Goodbye, Agent.
Henry Leland, the game's initial antagonist, for example, can easily become an accomplice, assuming the player acts in accordance with his wishes. Or, if the player gravitates towards another villain, he merely becomes sidelined as a stepping stone in a larger narrative. Meanwhile, friendly or hostile factions can respectively assist or hinder the player on missions, whether in the form of armed troops or intelligence, every relationship forming a visible piece on a larger chessboard. If, in most games, the issue of choice is predominantly a moral judgment, then Alpha Protocol adds another layer to the mix by explicitly surfacing the gamification of its narrative through the frame story of espionage. Essentially, this is just as much a game to Thornton as it is to the player.
Nazareth said nothing about an American.
I'm not looking to advertise my presence, only to do business.
Business, eh?
Check with Nazareth if you don't believe me. He's waiting for me, and my down payment.
I call ahead. Go on through. Can't believe you bluffed those guards.
It's a subtle difference, but the spy game aesthetic shifts the entire perspective of choice in Alpha Protocol, away from building a character and more towards building an ideology. Through their actions, players are consciously setting the course of the narrative, divorced from any in-game assumptions of right or wrong. The player is free to contradict themselves, to lie, or just change their minds, unconcerned with shaping a believable character, but rather what that character represents.
He described you as a man of your word. Patriotic, I believe, also came into the conversation. But Mr. Marburg was not always the best judge of character.
As a result, Alpha Protocol eschews the trappings of most dialogue systems, in that it doesn't contain a karma bar or any trite representations of morality or self-worth, but merely tracks the player's individual relationships on a person-to-person basis. Siding with Al-Samad, the game's fictional Middle Eastern terror group, will, needless to say, put the player in poor stead with the American government, but it's never expressly denounced as out of character or the bad option. Both Thornton and those around him act according to the ideology they're endorsing, without so much as a wink or a nod. Traditionally, the bad option in choice-based video games always has this wink or nod. It finds its appeal voyeuristically. Every jerk and arsehole option plays up to the cameras, often as the comedic underside of an assumed set of ethical values. Outbursts of violence or aggression, like Mass Effect's infamous interview responses,
I've had enough of your snide insinuations.
will never detract from the player's unending march towards a greater good. The narrative's underlying beliefs are established by the developers and can rarely be genuinely tested, but only toyed with. They're expressly funny because we know that Commander Shepard isn't supposed to act like this. In Alpha Protocol though, this voyeurism is largely absent. Making choices that align with a certain character or faction will adjust the narrative stakes to reflect their particular outlook, whether that means you're working towards the downfall of US security or merely earning a vacation for Thornton. Scrutinised up close, the game is an ethical black hole, in which the player is the only effective force of judgment.
Sorry, radio went on the fritz. Westridge. Nasri pulled a gun on me, tried to escape. Had to put him down.
Damn it!
Based on the player's allegiances, representations of right and wrong will shift multiple times throughout the game based on who they know and how they've approached them.
Clearance, so then I have to erase them so they don't expose me.
Expose what exactly? Your overuse of quotation marks?
I think it's time we reconsidered Alpha Protocol. If you like choice-based narratives in video games, I think you should give it a try. This is a game that proves that for all of our talk of moral choices in video games, the issue of choice itself is still fertile ground. Over the last few years, interactive narratives have become increasingly prevalent. The successes of Telltale and David Cage games are just symptoms of a larger push towards storytelling in video games, a push that's being led by an evolving idea of choice. The void between a developer scripting and the player's interaction is now under more scrutiny than ever. Although, at its worst, Alpha Protocol didn't quite live up to its ambition. Certain characters are left unused or forgotten, a large number of plot strands are left untied, and it's worth reiterating that sneaking animation really is something else. At its best, it seems to genuinely engage with the player's choices, regardless of how objectionable or absurd they may be. When push comes to shove, the game doesn't care who or what you're fighting for, but rather fully embraces the notion the players can have the choice to fight for what they want. We often talk about the grey areas in video games as resting between the predetermined rock and a hard place of one bad or another, between black and white. Alpha Protocol, though, in providing the player with a blank slate on which to impress their ideological leanings, proves that grey isn't just a space between two colours, but has the potential to be a colour in its own right.
Does the name Alpha Protocol mean anything to you?
No, not really.